She answered the phone knowing it would be Rachel, her daughter-in-law, whose honey-sweet voice had learned to mask calculation and disdain for 6 long years, the same 6 years Angela had quietly funneled thousands from her widow's account into their gleaming life while living in a modest apartment and wearing worn clothes, letting them believe she was just a struggling old woman on Social Security when the truth was she could afford 10 of their marble kitchens but chose love over pride. Month after month, as Rachel planned another expensive dinner, never knowing the lonely woman she pitied was the silent architect of every comfort they enjoyed. If you are drawn to stories that restore your faith in love, family, and the quiet power of kindness, you're in the right place. Be sure to subscribe and tap the bell so you won't miss a single moment of what comes next. Now, the phone rang with that particular shrill urgency that always made my heart skip just a little, and I knew before I even glanced at the caller ID that it would be Rachel, my daughter-in-law, whose voice carried the kind of manufactured sweetness that had learned to recognize as dangerous over these past 6 years since David brought her home that first Christmas when she'd surveyed our modest dining room with those calculating eyes that seemed to inventory every piece of furniture, every photograph, every hint of what she perceived as our financial standing. Angela, Rachel's voice poured through the receiver like honey laced with something bitter. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, though I suppose you're never really busy these days, are you? The pause that followed felt deliberate, weighted with the kind of meaning that made my chest tighten, because even through the phone I could picture her standing in that gleaming kitchen of theirs, the one with the marble countertops and professional-grade appliances, the one I'd helped make possible through monthly checks that neither she nor David ever questioned, never wondering how a woman living in a modest apartment could afford such generosity month after month for 6 long years. I pressed the phone closer to my ear and forced my voice to remain steady even as my free hand unconsciously smoothed the worn fabric of my favorite armchair, the one Harold had bought me for our 20th anniversary, back when we still believed we had decades ahead of us instead of just 3 more precious years before the heart attack that left me alone with too much money and no one to share it with except a son who'd grown distant and proud, and a daughter-in-law who seemed to view my presence in their lives as somewhere between obligation and burden. Not at all, dear, I managed, though the word dear felt like sawdust in my mouth. What can I do for you? Even as I asked the question, I was already calculating in my head whether their rent was due soon, whether Rachel had noticed any unusual expenses, whether this call might somehow be connected to the carefully orchestrated financial ballet I'd been performing behind the scenes all these years, transferring money from my account to theirs through a web of carefully structured gifts and anonymous payments that kept their heads above water while allowing David to maintain his pride and Rachel to maintain her illusions about their middle-class stability. Well, Rachel continued, and I could hear the rustle of what sounded like expensive paper in the background, probably wedding invitations or charity event programs, the kind of social obligations that aim to multiply around her like expensive accessories. David got his promotion, you know, the one he's been working toward for months, and we thought it would be nice to have a little celebration dinner, just family, nothing fancy of course. Though I've planned something special for the menu. The way she said nothing fancy made my stomach clench, because Rachel's definition of simple had always skewed toward what most people would consider extravagant. And I found myself wondering, not for the first time, how they managed to maintain their lifestyle on David's salary alone, especially with Rachel's shopping habits and their social commitments and the private schools they'd already started researching for children. They didn't even have yet all of it floating on the financial foundation I'd quietly built beneath them, without ever once receiving acknowledgement or gratitude, or even basic awareness of what I'd sacrificed to keep their dreams intact. That sounds wonderful, I heard myself saying, though wonderful felt like the wrong word entirely for this growing knot of dread in my chest. David must be so pleased about the promotion, he's worked so hard for it. Which was true. David had always been hard-working, even as a child, even when Harold was still alive and we could afford to give him everything he needed without thinking twice about the cost, back when money was just a tool rather than this complicated dance of pride and sacrifice and hidden generosity that had defined my relationship with my son's family for years. Oh, he is. Rachel's voice took on that particular tone she used when discussing David's achievements, as if she'd personally engineered his success. And I thought, since you've been looking a little tear Ed lately, maybe a nice family dinner would be good for you, you know, something to get you out of that apartment and around people who care about you. The concern in her voice felt performative, rehearsed like lines from a play she'd practiced in front of her bathroom mirror, and I wondered if this was how she saw me now. Just a lonely old woman rattling around in my small space counting pennies and surviving on social security checks, completely unaware that my small space was a choice, not a necessity, that my modest lifestyle allowed me to funnel thousands of dollars their way every month. Without David ever having to swallow his pride or Rachel ever having to adjust her expectations. I walked to my kitchen window while she talked, looking out at the neat little garden I'd planted last spree. Ain't nothing elaborate, just some tomatoes and herbs and flowers that reminded me of the much grander gardens Harold and I had maintained at our old house, the one I'd sold after he died, not because I had to, but because rattling around in all those empty rooms felt like drowning in memories, and the smaller apartment felt more manageable, more like the kind of place where a woman like me belonged according to everyone's assumptions about widows and their supposedly limited means. When were you thinking? I asked, though part of me already knew I'd say yes because saying no to Rachel required energy I wasn't sure I possessed, and because David would be disappointed if I declined. And because maybe somewhere deep down I still harbored the foolish hope that somehow this dinner might be different, that somehow the truth about everything I'd done for them might emerge naturally, organically, without the need for dramatic revelations or painful confrontations. This Saturday evening around 6, Rachel said, "Nothing too late. I know you probably get tired easily these days, and I've invited my parents to there, so looking forward to seeing you again." The mention of Karen and Stephen Mills made my heart sink a little lower because Rachel's parents had never made any secret of their opinion about my circumstances, their barely concealed pity for what they perceived as my reduced circumstances, their gentle but persistent suggestions about assisted living facilities and senior discounts, and all the other reminders of what they assumed to be my precarious financial situation. Karen Mills, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and her designer handbags, had a way of speaking to me that made me feel like a charity case, like someone to be helped rather than respected. And Stephen, with his awkward pat on my shoulder and his too loud voice, as if age had somehow affected my hearing rather than just my patience for their particular brand of well-meaning condescension, neither of them ever questioning how their daughter and son-in-law managed to maintain their lifestyle, or wondering about the mysterious financial cushion that kept appearing whenever David faced unexpected expenses or career transitions. That sounds lovely. I lied smoothly because lying had become easier over the years, easier than explaining or defending or trying to make people understand the choices I'd made and why I'd made them. Should I bring anything, though I already knew Rachel would insist I didn't need to bring anything, would probably make some comment about not wanting me to go to any trouble, as if preparing a simple side dish would somehow overwhelm my supposedly limited capabilities. "Oh no, Angela, please don't worry about anything." Rachel's voice carried that familiar note of gentle dismissal. "You just focus on getting there safely, maybe take a taxi if driving feels like too much. I know how intimidating traffic can be at your age." The casual assumption that driving might be beyond my capabilities at 68 made me grip the phone a little tighter, because I'd been driving longer than Rachel had been alive and my reflexes were still sharp enough to navigate traffic that would probably terrify someone who'd grown up expecting everything to be handed to them on silver platters. After we hung up, I sat in my armchair staring at the phone and feeling the familiar weight of all the things I couldn't say settling over me, like a heavy blanket, the weight of monthly rent payments made anonymously through a property management company, the weight of utility bills mysteriously paid by charitable organizations that existed only in my carefully constructed financial mythology, the weight of David's student loan payments that had been quietly absorbed into my monthly budget, without him ever knowing where the money actually came from. 6 years of this careful dance, 6 years of watching Rachel plan elaborate vacations and redecorate their apartment and shop for designer clothes, while making casual comments about my tight budget and my fixed income. 6 years of sitting quietly while she explained to her friends how difficult it must be for someone like me to manage on so little, never once questioning the mathematical impossibility of David's salary covering their lifestyle, never once wondering about the guardian angel who kept their financial ship afloat through every storm, every setback, every expensive whim that should have sunk them years ago. I thought about Harold then, about how he'd always said I was too generous for my own good, too willing to sacrifice my own comfort for others, too reluctant to demand recognition for the things I did out of love, and I wondered what he'd think about this elaborate charade I'd constructed, this careful preservation of David's pride, Peterson watering her flowers the same way she did every day at exactly 4:30, and something about her predictable routine, her simple, uncomplicated life made me envious in a way. That surprised me because here I was, a woman with more money than I could spend into lifetimes, living like a pauper so my son could live like a king and my daughter-in-law could continue believing she'd married well rather than simply married someone whose mother loved him enough to bankroll his dreams indefinitely. Saturday was 3 days away, 3 days to decide whether I would continue this exhausting performance or whether the time had finally come to let Rachel and David and everyone else know exactly who had been carrying them all these years and what that had cost me, not just financially but emotionally, spiritually, in terms of the relationship with my son that I'd sacrificed on the altar of his pride and his wife's impossible expectations. 3 days to decide whether I was brave enough to finally tell the truth about the rent I'd been paying and the future I'd been funding and the family I'd been holding together with nothing but love and money and the kind of patient silence that was slowly eating me alive from the inside out. Those 3 days passed like a slow-motion countdown each morning, bringing me closer to Saturday evening and the decision I still hadn't made about whether to keep carrying this burden of secret generosity or finally let the truth spill across Rachel's perfectly set dining table and shatter all the careful illusions we'd built together over these past 6 years. And by Friday night, I found myself standing in front of my closet, trying to decide what one wears to potentially destroy a family dynamic that had been held together by nothing but my silence and my bank account. I chose the navy dress Harold had always said brought out my eyes, the one that made me feel dignified rather than diminished. And as I drove through the familiar streets toward David and Rachel's apartment complex on Saturday evening, I couldn't help but notice the way the late afternoon sun caught the windows of their building, making it gleam like something precious, something worth protecting, and I wondered if after tonight they'd still think of it as home or if my revelations would poison even the walls I'd helped them afford. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt longer than usual and I found myself studying my reflection in the polished steel doors, seeing a woman who looked tired not from age but from the weight of carrying other people's lives without acknowledgement. And when the elevator dinged softly and the doors slid open, I took a breath that felt like preparation for battle, even though I still wasn't sure which side I'd choose to fight on. When the moment came, Rachel answered the door, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month, her smile bright and automatic as she air-kissed my cheek in that performative way she'd learned from her mother, and I could smell her expensive perfume, the kind that came in heavy glass bottles from department store counters, where salespeople treated you differently based on the shoes you wore and the handbag you carried. "Angela, you look lovely," she said, though her eyes were already scanning past me toward the hallway as if checking to see if I'd brought anything embarrassing with me. Come in, David's just finishing up some work calls. You know how important this promotion is. He's been so busy lately, but of course you understand how demanding his career can be." The way she said it suggested that I couldn't possibly understand, having never had what she would consider a real career myself, just the decades I'd spent managing Harold's business affairs and raising David, and somehow accumulating the kind of wealth that now flowed invisibly into their lives like an underground river they'd never bothered to trace to its source. The apartment looked exactly as I'd expected, flawlessly decorated with the kind of casual elegance that required both money and time to achieve. Fresh flowers in crystal vases that caught the light just so, throw pillows arranged with mathematical precision on furniture that managed to look both expensive and comfortable, the sort of space that appeared effortlessly perfect but actually required constant maintenance and considerable financial investment to sustain. David emerged from their home office still holding his phone and wearing the kind of apologetic smile that meant he'd been hoping to avoid whatever family drama might unfold tonight. And when he hugged me, I could feel the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like someone preparing for an ordeal rather than enjoying a celebration, and I wondered when exactly I'd become someone my own son felt he needed to manage rather than simply love. "Mom," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice, even if it was edged with something that might have been worry. "Thanks for coming. I know Saturday nights aren't always easy for you." The assumption that Saturday nights were somehow more difficult for me than any other night stung in a way I hadn't expected, because my Saturday nights were often fuller than theirs, filled with books and music, and the kind of quiet contentment that came from financial security they couldn't even imagine, but I smiled and nodded because correcting him would require explanations I wasn't ready to give. "Congratulations on the promotion, sweetheart," I said, squeezing his hand. "Your father would be so proud of how hard you've worked." Which was true. Harold had always believed in David's potential, had always said our son would make his mark on the world, though I doubted Harold could have predicted the circuitous route that Mark would take or the price his mother would pay to ensure David never stumbled along the way. Rachel had disappeared into the kitchen, and I could hear the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing with just a little more force than necessary, the kind of controlled noise that suggested she was managing her own tension through the familiar ritual of hostess preparation. And when she reappeared carrying a tray of what looked like expensive appetizers, her smile had that brittle quality that meant she was working harder than she wanted to appear to be working. "I thought we'd start with some light bites," she announced, setting the tray on the coffee table with careful precision. "Nothing too heavy, of course. I know you probably don't eat much these days, living alone and all, but I wanted to make sure there were options that wouldn't be too rich for you." The casual cruelty of the comment hit me like a slap disguised as concern, and I found myself wondering if Rachel had any idea how many meals I'd skipped over the years. Not because I couldn't afford them, but because I was sending that money to cover their grocery bills instead. The doorbell rang before I could formulate a response, and Rachel's face brightened with genuine relief as she hurried to answer it, welcoming her parents with the kind of enthusiasm she'd never quite managed to muster for me. And I watched Karen Mills sweep into the room like a woman who owned every space. She entered, her designer handbag perfectly coordinated with shoes that probably cost more than my monthly utility bill. The bill I didn't actually pay because that money went toward keeping their lights on instead. "Angela dear," Karen said, approaching me with that particular brand of sympathetic warmth reserved for elderly relatives and struggling acquaintances, "you look well considering everything you must be on through these days. It can't be easy managing on your own at your age." She settled beside me on the sofa with a little sigh, as if the effort of being kind to someone in my supposed circumstances was mildly exhausting, and I found myself calculating how many of their family vacations I'd secretly funded while listening to Karen's lectures about the importance of planning for retirement. Stephen Mills offered his usual awkward nod and pat on the shoulder, his discomfort with what he perceived as my reduced circumstances written across his face like an apology he didn't know how to voice. And I remembered suddenly the Christmas when he'd slipped me a $50 bill with a whispered suggestion that I use it for something special for myself, as if $50 represented some meaningful windfall rather than what I typically spent on coffee in a week back when I allowed myself such small luxuries. "So Rachel tells us you're doing well, Angela," Karen continued, settling her handbag beside her with the kind of care reserved for precious objects, "though of course it must be such an adjustment living in that little apartment after the lovely home you and Harold shared. I imagine the rent alone must stretch your budget quite thin these days, especially with everything getting so expensive." The way she said it made it sound like a gentle inquiry, but I could hear the underlying assessment, the careful probing to confirm what they all assumed about my financial situation. Rachel appeared with wine glasses balanced on another tray, her movements sharp with the kind of energy that comes from trying too hard to make everything perfect, and, as she distributed the glasses, I noticed the wine was from a vintage that would have cost more than most people spent on an entire dinner, let alone just the drinks, and I wondered if any of them ever questioned how they managed to afford such luxuries on David's salary alone. "I thought we'd have the Bordeaux tonight," Rachel announced, as if the choice of wine was somehow significant. "David picked it up last week. It's supposed to be exceptional, though of course I know wine isn't really something you probably indulge in much anymore, Angela, given your circumstances, but I thought just this once for the celebration." The casual dismissal of my supposed inability to appreciate good wine made Sam clench, because I recognized that tone, the one she used when she'd decided to say something she'd been rehearsing in her head for weeks. Karen Mills leaned forward slightly with the kind of eager attention that suggested she already knew what was coming, and Stephen shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while David looked between his wife and mother with growing alarm, as if he could sense the approaching storm, but had no idea how to prevent it. And I found myself gripping my napkin in my lap so tightly my knuckles had gone white against the dark fabric. "It's just that," Rachel continued, her voice taking on that particular blend of concern and condescension that had become her specialty over the years, "I've been thinking about our family's financial situation and how important it is for everyone to contribute what they can, especially during challenging times like these when everything is getting so expensive and money is tight for all of us. The way she emphasized all of us made it clear that she was building towards something, and my chest began to feel tight as I realized exactly where this conversation was heading. Rachel, David said quietly, and there was warning in his voice. Though whether he was trying to protect me or simply avoid an uncomfortable scene, I couldn't tell. Maybe we should focus on celebrating tonight, rather than discussing family finances. But Rachel was already shaking her head with the kind of determined expression that meant she'd crossed some internal line and wouldn't be easily deterred from whatever point she'd decided needed. Making no, David, she said, and her voice had grown stronger, more confident, as if she'd found her footing on familiar ground. I think it's important to be honest about these things, especially when they affect the whole family. And I've been watching and thinking, and frankly I'm concerned about the burden we've all been carrying without really acknowledging it. She turned to look directly at me, and there was something in her eyes that made my blood run cold, something that looked almost like triumph mixed with righteous indignation. The burden? I heard myself ask, though my voice sounded strange and distant, as if it were coming from someone else entirely, and Rachel nodded with the kind of patient expression she might use with a child who was being deliberately obtuse about something obvious to everyone else in the room. Well, yes, Angela, she said, and there was no mistaking the edge in her voice now. The financial burden, I mean, let's be honest here, you haven't exactly been pulling your weight, have you? The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the blood drain from my face as the full implications of what she was saying began to register, not just the accusation itself, but the fact that she was making it here in front of everyone at what was supposed to be a celebration dinner. David started to speak, but Rachel held up her hand to silence him, her eyes never leaving my face as she continued with the kind of momentum that suggested she'd been planning this moment for longer than I'd realized. I know it's uncomfortable to talk about money, but someone needs to say it. You've been living off David's generosity for years now without contributing anything meaningful to help with our expenses. And frankly, it's becoming a real strain on our finances. The irony was so complete, so perfectly backwards, that for a moment I couldn't even process what I was hearing, because sitting there at a table set with china I'd helped pay for drinking wine that my money had purchased in an apartment whose rent I'd been covering for 6 years, listening to Rachel accuse me of being a financial burden felt like stepping through a mirror into some alternate reality, where everything was exactly reversed from the truth. That's not, David began, but Rachel was already moving forward with the kind of determined energy that suggested she'd been storing up these grievances for months or maybe years and was finally allowing herself the satisfaction of voicing them all at once. I'm sorry, but someone needs to say this, she continued, and her voice had taken on that particular quality of righteous anger that made it clear she believed every word she was saying. David has been supporting you for years, covering your expenses, helping with your rent and utilities and groceries, and it's affecting our ability to plan for our own future, to save for a house, to start thinking about children, and I'm tired of pretending it's not a problem. The accusation that David had been supporting me when the truth was so completely the opposite made something snap inside my chest, and I found myself staring at Rachel with a mixture of shock and growing fury, because not only was she wrong about everything, she was wrong in the most cruel and public way possible, making me out to be some kind of charity case in front of her parents while sitting in luxury I'd made possible. Rachel, please, David said, and his voice carried real distress. Now, this isn't the time or place for this conversation, and you're making assumptions about things you don't fully understand. But even as he tried to defend me, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the way he didn't quite deny what she was saying, because how could he deny it when he'd never bothered to question where the money came from when their rent mysteriously got paid, or their utility bills disappeared, or unexpected windfalls appeared just when they needed the most. Karen Mills was nodding with the kind of satisfied expression that suggested she'd been waiting for someone to finally voice what they'd all been thinking, and Stephen looked uncomfortable, but not surprised, as if this topic had been discussed in their home before tonight. And I realized with growing horror that Rachel's accusation wasn't spontaneous but planned, coordinated, maybe even approved by her parents, who'd been watching my supposed struggle with the kind of pity that felt like a slap across the face. I think Rachel is just being honest about a difficult situation, Karen said, and her voice carried that tone of gentle reasonableness that made her words feel like poison wrapped in silk. And while it's uncomfortable to discuss these things openly sometimes it's necessary for the good of the family. And Angela dear, you have to understand that David and Rachel have their own expenses, their own dreams and goals, and it's not fair to expect them to carry your financial responsibilities indefinitely. The word carry made me want to laugh or scream, or maybe both, because the only person who'd been carrying anyone in this family was me, and I'd been doing it so quietly, so invisibly, that they'd somehow convinced themselves the opposite was true, that I was the burden rather than the foundation that kept their entire financial structure from collapsing. I never asked David to support me, I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt, though there was something building inside me, something that felt dangerous and necessary all at once. I've never asked any of you for financial help, which was true. I'd never asked for anything. I'd simply given and given and given, while they took and took and took without ever questioning where their good fortune was coming from. Rachel let out a little laugh that had no humor in it at all. Well, of course you didn't ask directly, she said, but Angela, you have to see how your situation affects all of us, how your inability to contribute creates pressure on David to pick up the slack, and frankly it's not sustainable. We're trying to build a life together and we can't keep subsidizing yours indefinitely. The word subsidizing was the final straw, the last cruel twist of reality that pushed me past every boundary I'd set for myself over these 6 years of careful silence and hidden sacrifice. And I felt something shift inside me, something that had been compressed and contained for too long, finally reaching the point where it couldn't be held back any longer. My inability to contribute, I repeated, and there was something in my voice that made everyone at the table suddenly go very still, as if they'd finally sensed the danger they'd been walking toward all evening without realizing it. My inability to contribute to this family? The questions hung in the air like challenges, and I could see Rachel's confidence begin to waver slightly, as if she was finally recognizing that she might have pushed something she didn't understand further than was safe. David reached across the table toward me, his face pale with what looked like genuine alarm. Mom, he said quietly, maybe we should all take a step back here and talk about this more calmly later when everyone's had time to think. But I was beyond thinking, beyond the careful calculations that had governed my behavior for so long, beyond the desire to protect everyone's feelings at the expense of my own dignity and self-respect. No, David, I said, and my voice was growing stronger, clearer, as if some fog I'd been living in for years was finally beginning to lift. I think it's time everyone understood exactly who has been contributing to this family, and who has been taking, and how long that's been going on, because clearly there are some very serious misunderstandings that need to be corrected right now. The silence that followed was complete and electric, and I could see the exact moment when Rachel began to understand that whatever she'd thought she was unleashing tonight was about to turn into something much bigger and more dangerous than she'd bargained for. But it was too late now. The words were already forming in my throat, and after 6 years of swallowing them, I was finally ready to let them spill across her perfect table and shatter every assumption they'd built their lives around. The silence stretched between us like a held breath, and I could feel something fundamental shifting inside me, some carefully constructed dam finally cracking under 6 years of accumulated pressure. And I looked around the table at these people I'd been protecting with my silence, my money, my careful preservation of their illusions, and realized that the time for protection was over, that perhaps it had been over for longer than I'd been willing to admit to myself. Since we're talking about financial contributions, I said, and my voice sounded different now, clearer and stronger than it had in years, as if speaking this truth was giving me back parts of myself I'd forgotten I possessed. Let me tell you about mine. I set my napkin down beside my plate with deliberate care, watching as Rachel's confident expression began to shift into something that looked almost like uncertainty, as if she was finally beginning to sense that the conversation had moved into territory she hadn't mapped. Angela, David started, but I held up my hand, the same gesture Rachel had used to silence him earlier, and there was something in my posture now that made him stop mid-sentence, his eyes widening as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years, seeing not the modest elderly woman he'd grown accustomed to dismissing, but someone else entirely, someone who might actually have something important to say. For 6 years, I continued, and each word felt like a small liberation, a piece of truth finally allowed to exist in the open air. I have been paying your rent, David, yours and Rachel's, every month without fail, every single month for 72 months in a row. The numbers fell into the silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock that I could see spreading across their faces as the implications of what I was saying began to register. Rachel's fork clattered against her plate, and she was staring at me with an expression of complete disbelief, as if I'd just announced that I could fly, or read minds, or perform some other impossible feat. And for a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, marking time in a world that had suddenly shifted on its axis. "That's not," Rachel began, but her voice faltered and died, because what could she say? How could she argue with a truth so complete, so documented, so easily verified that even her practiced confidence couldn't find purchase against it? And I watched as the color drained from her face, leaving her looking smaller, somehow diminished in a way that would have felt satisfying if I hadn't been so exhausted by the years of pretending. $1,800 a month, I said, and my voice was gaining strength with each revelation, each fact laid bare after years of careful concealment transferred through Riverside Property Managing. "And so you'd never have to know where it came from, so David could maintain his pride and you could maintain your assumptions about my circumstances." I turned to look directly at David, whose face had gone white with what looked like a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. "Mom," he whispered, and there was something broken in his voice, something that suggested he was finally beginning to understand not just what I'd done, but what it had cost me to do it in silence for so long. "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say anything?" But even as he asked the question, I could see in his eyes that he already knew the answer, that he understood exactly why I'd chosen secrecy over recognition, pride preservation over personal acknowledgement. "Because," I said, and there was no anger in my voice now, just a bone-deep weariness that came from carrying other people's lives for so long without rest. "You never would have accepted it if you'd known and where it was coming from, and Rachel never would have let you accept it, and you both needed it more than you needed to know the truth about where it came from." Which was true. I'd watched them struggle those first months after they'd moved in together, watched David's salary stretched thin by Rachel's expectations, watched them argue about money in hushed voices when they thought no one could hear. Karen Mills was sitting frozen in her chair, her mouth slightly open, as if she'd forgotten how to close it. Aunt Stephen was staring at his wine glass as if it might contain answers to questions he hadn't known he should be asking, and I realized that this revelation wasn't just changing how they saw me, but how they saw themselves, their assumptions about their own financial stability, their daughter's marriage, their place in this carefully constructed family hierarchy. "But that's impossible," Rachel said, and there was desperation in her voice, now the kind that comes from watching your entire understanding of reality crumble in real time. "You live in that tiny apartment, and you shop at discount stores. You said you were on a fixed income." She was grasping for any explanation that would make sense of what I was telling them anyway, to reconcile the modest lifestyle they'd observed with the financial generosity. Why I was claiming I live in a small apartment, instead of making us look like fools. And I could hear in her voice that she still didn't quite grasp the fundamental issue, that this wasn't about the money itself but about respect and recognition, and the basic human dignity of being acknowledged for the sacrifices you make for the people you love. "Because," I said, and my voice was steady now, calm with the clarity that comes from finally speaking truth that has been suppressed too long. "I thought if I made your life easier without you knowing it, you might eventually come to value me for who I am rather than what you assumed I could or couldn't contribute, but instead you used my generosity against me, used the very stability I provided as evidence of my inadequacy. And that, Rachel, is why I'm telling you now, because 6 years of silence has been long enough." The words settled over the table like a final judgment, and I could see in their faces that they understood now not just what I'd done, but why I'd done it and why I'd finally chosen to reveal it. And as I sat there surrounded by the luxury I'd made possible, I felt for the first time in years like I was exactly where I belonged, not hiding in the shadows of their lives, but standing fully in the light of my own choices and their consequences. The silence that followed my revelation felt like the aftermath of an explosion, heavy and ringing and full of the kind of stillness that comes when something fundamental has been permanently altered. And I watched as each person at the table began to process what I'd told them, their faces cycling through shock and disbelief and what looked like the beginning stages of a grief I wasn't sure any of us were prepared to navigate together. Rachel was the first to break the silence, but when she spoke her voice had changed entirely, the confident condescension replaced by something raw and desperate and almost childlike in its refusal to accept what couldn't be denied. "This is insane," she said, wiping at her streaked makeup with the back of her hand. "You can't just sit there and claim you've been secretly supporting us for years, without any proof, without any documentation, This is exactly the kind of manipulative behavior I'd expect from someone who feels guilty about being a burden on their family. The word manipulative hit me like a physical blow because it was so completely backwards, so perfectly inverted from the truth that for a moment I couldn't even formulate a response. And I found myself staring at her with something approaching amazement at her ability to twist my revelation into evidence of my wrongdoing rather than acknowledgement of my sacrifice. Manipulative, I repeated, and there was something in my voice that made David flinch as if he could hear the danger building beneath my careful composure. 6 years of paying your bills without asking for recognition or gratitude or even basic courtesy is manipulative. I could feel my control beginning to slip again, the careful restraint I'd maintained even through my revelations starting to crack under the pressure of Rachel's continued all on my character. But David was already reaching toward his wife, his voice urgent with what sounded like genuine panic. Rachel, stop, please, just stop talking for a minute and think about what Mom is saying. Think about all the times our rent got paid when we didn't have the money. Think about how we never got eviction notices or utility shutoffs even when we were behind. Think about how many financial emergencies just mysteriously resolved themselves over the years. I could see the exact moment when David's words hit their mark, when Rachel's face changed from defiant denial to something that looked almost like fear. As she began to remember all those inexplicable reprieves, all those financial miracles that had kept their life stable even when their budget should have collapsed under the weight of her expectations and spending habits. No, she said, but her voice was smaller now, less certain. No, that's not what happened. We managed, we figured it out ourselves. We worked hard and made sacrifices, and if someone was helping us, then they should have told us. They should have been honest instead of sneaking around behind our backs making us look like charity cases. The way she said charity cases made it clear that being helped was somehow worse in her mind than struggling, that receiving assistance was more shameful than the alternative of actual hardship. Karen Mills had been sitting in stunned silence, but now she cleared her throat with the kind of delicate sound that meant she was preparing to say something she hoped would restore some semblance of social order to a situation that had spiraled completely beyond normal dinner conversation. Perhaps, she said in the tone of someone trying to mediate a dispute she didn't fully understand, we should all take a step back here and recognize that there may have been some miscommunication, some misunderstanding about everyone's financial situations, and hear the conflict in his voice, the way he was torn between defending me and managing his wife, between honoring my sacrifices and preserving his marriage. Rachel said, and her voice was so quiet now that we all had to lean forward to hear her. I just don't understand why you had to be so secretive about it, why you couldn't trust us enough to be honest, why you had to make us feel like we were taking care of you, when really you were taking care of us. It makes everything feel like a lie. And for the first time since this conversation began, I heard something in her voice that sounded almost like genuine hurt rather than defensive anger. Because I said, and my own voice was gentler now because I could see that underneath all her bluster and entitlement, Rachel was genuinely struggling to understand motivations that made no sense to someone who'd never had to choose between pride and survival. Honesty would have changed everything, and not necessarily for the better. And I thought that quietly ensuring your happiness was more important than loudly claiming credit for it. The explanation hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure any of us knew how to cross, and I found myself wondering if revealing the truth had been a mistake. If some secrets were meant to stay buried, if the cost of acknowledgement might turn out to be higher than the cost of continued silence had been. Karen Mills cleared her throat again, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been genuine remorse, though it was wrapped in the kind of careful language that allowed for multiple interpretations. Angela, I think we all owe you an apology for making assumptions about your circumstances, and perhaps we've all learned something important tonight about the danger of judging situations we don't fully understand. The careful apology made me realize that even now, even after everything I'd revealed, Karen was still trying to find a way to save face, to avoid fully acknowledging the depth of their misunderstanding and cruelty. And I felt something settle in my chest, something that felt like resignation mixed with a new kind of clarity about exactly where I stood with these people and what I could realistically expect from them going forward. Perhaps, I said, standing slowly from my chair and feeling suddenly exhausted by the weight of everything that had been said and revealed and damaged tonight, we should all take some time to think at what's been discussed here before we say anything else that we might regret. And as I moved toward the door, I could feel them watching me, David with guilt and confusion, Rachel with something that might have been the beginning of understanding, and Karen and Stephen with the uncomfortable awareness that their social gathering had become something much more complicated and painful than anyone had bargained for. But as I reached for my purse, I found myself wondering if this was how healing began, with everything broken and scattered across the table like the remains of a dinner that had become something else entirely, or if some damages were too deep and too long-standing to be repaired by truth alone, no matter how courageously or completely it was finally spoken. The drive home felt like traveling through a fog of my own making, every traffic light seeming to last longer than usual, giving me more time to replay the evening in my mind, more time to wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake in revealing secrets that had kept our family functioning, even if that function had been built on a foundation of lies and misunderstanding. And as I pulled into my apartment complex, I found myself questioning everything I'd said and done, as if speaking the truth had somehow made me the villain in a story I'd been trying to write as quietly as possible for 6 years. My hands were shaking as I unlocked my front door, and I realized that the adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was finally wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that felt heavier than anything physical. And I stood in my small living room looking around at the modest furniture and simple decorations that had somehow become evidence of my supposed poverty in their eyes rather than symbols of the choices I'd made to live simply so others could live well. I needed to talk to someone who would understand, someone who knew the whole story, someone who wouldn't try to manage my emotions or protect anyone's feelings except mine. And so I found myself reaching for the phone and dialing Mary's number, even though it was past 9 o'clock on a Saturday night, and she was probably settled in with her evening tea and her mystery novels, expecting nothing more dramatic than a fictional murder to disturb her peace. Angela. Mary's voice came through the receiver, warm and concerned, because she knew I wouldn't call this late unless something significant had happened. What's wrong, sweetheart? You sound like you've been through a war. And maybe I had been through a war, maybe that's exactly what it felt like to finally stop fighting on everyone else's behalf and start fighting for myself for the first time in longer than I care. "Do you remember?" I told them, I said, and my voice came out smaller than I'd intended, like a child confessing to breaking something precious. I told them about the money, about everything, about all of it, Mary, and I don't know if I did the right thing. I don't know if I should have just kept quiet and let things continue the way they were. The words tumbled out of me without pause or organization, because I needed to say them to someone who would listen without judgment or agenda. There was a pause on Mary's end of the line, and I could picture her settling back in her favorite chair, the one by the window where she did her thinking, the one Harold had helped her pick out when she'd moved into her own small apartment after her husband died, and she'd started the difficult process of rebuilding a life around her own needs rather than someone else's expectations. "Oh, honey," she said, finally, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like relief. "You finally did it. You finally told them the truth about what you've been doing all these years." There was no surprise in her tone, because Mary had been the one urging me to speak up for months now, the one who'd listened to me vent about Rachel's casual cruelties and David's oblivious acceptance of financial help he didn't even realize he was receiving. "But Mary," I said, and I could hear the doubt creeping into my voice again, "you should have seen Rachel's face. You should have heard the things she said. She called me manipulative. She said I was playing the martyr. She acted like I'd been deceiving them all these years instead of helping them. And maybe she's right. Maybe I should have been honest from the beginning. Maybe I created this whole mess by trying to help without acknowledgement." Mary made a sound that was somewhere between a snort and a laugh, the kind of noise she reserved for particularly ridiculous statements. "Angela Kent," she said, and her voice had taken on the no-nonsense tone she used when she thought I was being deliberately dense. "Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer before you give it to me." I waited, because Mary had a way of cutting through emotional confusion with questions that forced clarity, even when clarity was the last thing you thought you wanted, and I trusted her judgment more than my own, especially when it came to situations where my tendency to put other people's comfort ahead of my own well-being had gotten me into trouble. "In the 6 years you've been supporting David and Rachel," she said slowly, as if she wanted to make sure I heard every word, "did you ever once ask them for anything in return? Did you ever demand gratitude or recognition or even basic courtesy as payment for your generosity?" The question hung in the air between us, and I found myself really considering it, really examining my motivations and actions over the years. No. I said finally, I never asked for anything, I just wanted them to be happy. I wanted David's marriage to work. I wanted them to have the life Rachel dreamed of having. And as I said it, I realized that this was true, that my help had come without strings attached, without expectations beyond the hope that their happiness might somehow reflect back on me in the form of a closer relationship with my son. And in those same 6 years, Mary continued, how many times did they thank you for what they assumed were your modest contributions to family gatherings? How many times did they acknowledge your presence as valuable rather than obligatory? How many times did Rachel treat you with the kind of respect she'd show to someone she considered an equal? The questions were like surgical instruments, cutting straight to the heart of what had been bothering me for years. Never, I whispered, and the admission felt like confession, like acknowledging a truth I'd been trying to avoid facing. Mary, they treated me like a burden, like someone they had to tolerate out of family obligation, like David was doing me a favor by including me in their lives when really I was the one making their lives possible. The words came out in a rush of realization, and suddenly I could see the situation clearly for the first time in years. Exactly, Mary said, and there was satisfaction in her voice, the satisfaction of someone whose point had finally been understood. So tell me again how you were being manipulative by quietly ensuring their financial security, while they openly criticized your supposed inability to contribute to the family. You were literally holding together with your checkbook. The way she put it made the absurdity of Rachel's accusations crystal clear, and I felt something shift in my chest, something that had been tight and guilty beginning to loosen as I started to understand that speaking the truth hadn't made me the villain in this story, but had simply revealed who the real villains had been all along. But the way Rachel looked at me, I said, though I could already hear how weak the objection sounded, the way she accused me of lying and manipulation, it made me feel like maybe I really had been wrong to keep it secret. Maybe I should have found a way to help them that didn't require hiding the truth. Even as I said it, I knew Mary would have an answer for this too, because Mary had a way of seeing through emotional fog to practical reality. Angela, Mary said, and her voice was gentle, now patient in the way it got when she was explaining something she thought should be obvious. What do you think would have happened if you'd told them the truth from the beginning? If you'd walked up to David 6 years ago and said, here's $1,800 a month for your rent because I can afford it and you can't? I thought about it, really considered the scenario, and immediately I could see David's face, the way his pride would have crumpled, the way he would have refused the help or accepted it with such guilt and resentment that it would have poisoned our relationship anyway, and Rachel would have seen it as charity, would have resented being indebted to someone she already viewed as beneath her social standing. He would have said no, I said slowly, or he would have said yes, but hated himself for it and hated me for putting him in that position, and Rachel would have seen it as proof that I was trying to roll their lives, trying to buy my way into their good graces. The realization was both painful and liberating, because it confirmed that there had been no perfect way to handle the situation, no path that would have led to recognition without resentment, right? Mary said, so you chose the path that preserved everyone's dignity except your own. You chose to give without receiving credit, to help without being thanked, to sacrifice without being acknowledged. And now when you finally ask for the basic respect that should have been automatic, Rachel accuses you of manipulation, because acknowledging your generosity would require her to admit she's been wrong about you for 6 years. The analysis was so clear, so perfectly accurate, that I felt something like relief washing over me, the relief that comes from having someone else see the situation exactly as it was, rather than as everyone wished it could be. And I realized that my doubt about revealing the truth had been just another form of protecting other people's feelings at the expense of my own clarity. Mary, I said, and my voice was stronger now, more certain. What do I do now? How do I move forward from here? How do I have a relationship with them that acknowledges what I've done without making everyone miserable with guilt and obligation? Because that was the real question now that the truth was out: how to rebuild relationships that had been based on fundamental misunderstandings without destroying them entirely. You set boundaries, Mary said firmly. You decide what kind of treatment you're willing to accept and what kind you're not, and you stick to those decisions, even when it's uncomfortable, even when people try to make you feel guilty for having standards, even when Rachel tries to make you the villain for refusing to go back to being invisible. The word boundaries felt foreign in my mouth, like a concept I'd heard about but never really understood how to implement, because for so long my role in the family had been to adapt, to accommodate, to make myself smaller so others could be larger. And the idea of taking up space, demanding respect, insisting on acknowledgement, felt both terrifying and necessary. But what if they can't handle it? I asked. What if knowing the truth makes everything worse? What if David chooses Rachel over me? What if I end up more alone than I was before? The fears tumbled out because they were real, because losing my relationship with David entirely felt worse than having a relationship based on his misunderstanding of my circumstances. Angela, Mary said, and there was something fierce in her voice now, something protective and absolutely certain. If your son can't handle knowing that his mother is generous and loving and has been key, at least supporting his family for years, then that's his failure, not yours. And if his wife can't find gratitude for the woman who made her comfortable life possible, then that's her character defect, not your manipulation. The words hit me like cold water, shocking and clarifying, and I realized that I'd been so focused on managing everyone else's emotional reactions that I'd forgotten to consider whether their reactions were reasonable or fair or worthy of the accommodations I'd been making for them. You did nothing wrong, Mary continued. You loved your family in the most practical way possible. You saw a need and you filled it quietly and generously and without expecting anything in return except maybe basic courtesy, which you never received. And now that you finally asked for the recognition you deserve, they're trying to make you feel guilty for having needs and expectations like a normal human being. As she spoke, I could feel something fundamental shifting in my understanding of the situation and of myself, and I realized that the exhaustion I'd been carrying wasn't from the confrontation itself, but from 6 years of trying to be invisible while carrying visible loads, from trying to be selfless while others were openly selfish, from trying to maintain relationships that required me to deny my own worth in order to preserve other people's comfort. You're right, I said, and for the first time since leaving David's apartment, I felt like I could breathe properly. You're absolutely right, Mary. I did nothing wrong, and I'm not going to apologize for in Ali telling the truth about my own generosity. I'm not going to feel guilty for wanting acknowledgement, for wanting respect, for wanting to be treated like someone whose contributions matter. Good, Mary said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. That's the Angela I know, the woman who raised a successful son and built a beautiful life with Harold, the woman who has the strength and wisdom to help her family without destroying her own dignity in the process. You just forgot for a while that dignity includes the right to be recognized for your sacrifices. The conversation continued for another hour, but by the time I hung up the phone, I felt fundamentally different than I had when I dialed her number, and I realized that speaking my truth tonight hadn't been a mistake, but the first step toward reclaiming parts of myself I'd been giving away for years. And tomorrow I would begin the work of rebuilding my relationships with David and Rachel from a foundation of honesty rather than hidden sacrifice. And if they couldn't handle that truth, then perhaps they'd never been worthy of my generosity in the first place. Sunday morning came with the kind of clarity that sometimes follows difficult truths, the way dawn light can make landscapes look different than they did in darkness. And I woke up feeling more like myself than I had in years, as if Mary's words had somehow realigned parts of my identity that had been twisted out of shape by years of accommodating other people's comfort at the expense of my own dignity. And I knew without question that the conversation I needed to have with Rachel couldn't wait for her to process her shock or find her way to an apology that might never come. I called David first because I knew Rachel wouldn't answer my calls, wouldn't want to face another conversation that might challenge her worldview further. And when I heard my son's voice on the phone, tired and strained as if he'd spent the night wrestling with revelations that had upended everything he thought he knew about his family, I felt a mixture of love and determination that surprised me with its intensity. Mom, he said, and there was relief in his voice, as if he'd been hoping I would call, as if he'd been afraid that my revelation might somehow drive me away from them rather than demanding that they come closer to understanding who I really was. I'm so glad you called. I've been thinking about everything you said last night, and I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for not seeing what you were doing, for not protecting you from the things Rachel said, for not understanding how much you were sacrificing for us. His apology was genuine and heartfelt, but I could hear something else underneath it, something that sounded like fear that I might withdraw my support, now that the truth was out, that I might punish them for their blindness by taking away the financial foundation I'd quietly built beneath their lives. And I realized that even now, even after everything I'd revealed, David still didn't quite understand that my love wasn't conditional on their gratitude. David, I said, and my voice was steady in a way that felt new and powerful. I need to talk to Rachel today privately, just the two of us, without you trying to mediate or manage the conversation, because there are things that need to be said between us, things that can't be worked out through you as an intermediary. The request felt bold in a way that would have terrified me just days ago, but Mary's words had given me permission to take up space, to make demands, to insist on the conversations I needed rather than only the ones other people were comfortable having. There was a pause, and I could hear David breathing slowly, as if he was trying to decide whether granting my request would help or hurt the fragile situation we were all trying to navigate. "Are you sure that's a good idea, Mom?" he asked. "Rachel is still pretty upset about last night, and I'm not sure she's ready to have another difficult conversation so soon." The protective tone in his voice told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalties lay and why this conversation with Rachel needed to happen without his interference. "I'm not asking for your permission, David," I said gently but firmly. "I'm telling you what I need and asking you to arrange it because Rachel and I have to work this out between ourselves, or not at all, and you hovering over us trying to keep everyone comfortable isn't going to solve anything. It's just going to delay the inevitable reckoning that should have happened years ago." The words felt strange in my mouth, because I'd never spoken to David this way before, had never asserted my needs so directly, but it also felt right, felt like reclaiming authority I'd somehow given away without meaning to. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from David and Rachel's apartment, waiting for my daughter-in-law to arrive and trying to prepare myself for a conversation that could either begin the process of rebuilding our relationship on honest ground or end it entirely if she proved incapable of moving beyond her defensive anger to something approaching genuine understanding. And I found myself thinking about Harold and what he would say about this moment, about his wife finally standing up for herself after years of quiet accommodation. Rachel arrived 15 minutes late, looking like she'd spent as little time as possible getting ready, her usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled in a way that suggested she'd been crying or hadn't slept well, or both. And when she sat down across from me, her posture was defensive, her arms crossed as if she was preparing for another attack rather than hoping for a conversation that might lead somewhere healing. "I don't understand what you want from me, Angela," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from emotional upheaval. "You've already humiliated me in front of my parents, already made me look like an ungrateful fool, already turned David against me, so what more is there to say? What else do you need to accomplish with this meeting?" The raw pain in her voice was unmistakable, and for a moment, I felt the old familiar urge to comfort her, to minimize my own needs in service of her emotional stability. But Mary's voice was still fresh in my memory, her reminder that I had the right to expect respect and acknowledgement, and I pushed aside the impulse to make Rachel feel better at my own expense. "I want to understand," I said quietly, "how someone could live in comfort provided by another person's generosity for 6 years, and then publicly accuse that person of being a burden when the truth finally came to light." The question was direct but not cruel, designed to make her think rather than simply to wound. Rachel's face flushed red, and I could see her preparing another defensive response, another explanation for why her behavior was justified. But then, something seemed to shift behind her eyes, and instead of anger, what emerged looked almost like confusion. "I didn't know," she said, and her voice was smaller now, less certain. "Angela, I swear to you I didn't know about the money, about any of it. And I know that doesn't excuse the things I said, but you have to understand that from my perspective you were this woman who lived modestly and seemed to struggle financially. And I thought David was supporting you out of obligation." The explanation was honest in its way, and I could see that she genuinely believed what she was saying, but it also revealed something troubling about her assumptions about me and about the kind of life she thought someone like me deserved to live. "Rachel," I said, and I kept my voice level despite the anger that was building beneath my calm exterior, "what exactly made you think I was struggling financially? What evidence did you have that I needed David's support?" She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, as if she was realizing for the first time that her assumptions hadn't been based on concrete evidence, but on something else entirely, something she might not want to examine too closely. "You lived in that small apartment," she said finally. "You shopped carefully, you didn't spend money on expensive things, you seemed to live like someone who didn't have very much." The words came out hesitantly, as if she was beginning to understand how thin her reasoning had been. "So because I chose to live simply, I said, and now there was steel in my voice because I didn't flaunt wealth or buy things I didn't need. Because I was raised to be careful with money, you assumed I didn't have any, and therefore it was acceptable to treat me like a charity case, like someone whose contributions to the family were negligible, like someone whose feelings didn't matter as much as your comfort. The accusation hung between us like a challenge, and I watched as Rachel began to understand the full implications of what her assumptions had cost both of us. I never meant to hurt you, she said, and there were tears in her eyes again, but these seemed different from the defensive ours of the night before, more genuine, more connected to actual remorse than to wounded pride. I thought I was protecting David from feeling obligated to someone who couldn't reciprocate. I thought I was being practical about family resources. I never imagined that you were the one making our life possible. The admission was painful to hear because it revealed how completely she'd misunderstood the family dynamics, how thoroughly she'd inverted the reality of who was supporting whom. But even if I had been struggling, I said, and this was the heart of what I needed her to understand, even if David had been supporting me, would that have given you the right to humiliate me at a family dinner? Would that have justified treating me like a burden rather than like someone deserving of basic respect and courtesy? The question forced her to confront not just her factual errors, but her fundamental approach to people she perceived as having less than her. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands as if she might find answers there, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. No, she said, no, it wouldn't have justified that, and I can see now that I was cruel to you in ways that weren't fair. Regardless of what I thought the financial situation was, I treated you like you were less important, like your feelings mattered less than mine, and that was wrong. The acknowledgement was more than I'd expected, and yet somehow less than I'd hoped for, because it felt incomplete, tentative, as if she was testing the words rather than fully embracing their implications. Rachel, I said, and I leaned forward slightly, trying to make sure she understood the importance of what I was about to say. I don't need you to grovel or flagellate yourself for mistakes you made based on incomplete information, but I do need you to understand that moving forward, our relationship has to be based on mutual respect and recognition of what I've contributed to this family, not just financially but emotionally and practically, in ways you've never had to acknowledge before. She nodded slowly, but I could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she was struggling to reconcile this new version of me with the diminished figure she'd carried in her mind for years. I'm trying to understand, she said. I'm trying to process all of this, but Angela, you have to see how difficult this is for me, how much it changes everything I thought I knew about our family, about David's success, about our financial stability. It's like finding out that the ground you've been standing on isn't solid, that everything you've built is actually built on someone else's foundation. The metaphor was more accurate than she probably realized, and I found myself feeling something almost like sympathy for her disorientation, because having your understanding of reality completely overturned was genuinely difficult, even when that reality had been based on willful blindness to obvious truths. I understand that it's difficult, I said, but difficulty doesn't excuse cruelty, and the way you treated me yesterday, the way you've treated me for years, that can't continue if we're going to have any kind of relationship going forward. What do you want from me? She asked, and there was frustration in her voice again, but also something that might have been genuine curiosity. What would make this right? What would repair the damage? The tea's been done, the question suggested. She was beginning to understand that simple apologies wouldn't be enough, that meaningful change would require sustained effort and genuine transformation of her attitudes and behavior. I want you to see me, I said simply. I want you to see me as someone whose contributions matter, whose opinions have value, whose presence in this family is an asset rather than an obligation. I want you to treat me the way you treat someone you respected rather than someone you pitied, and I want you to understand that my financial support has never been about control or manipulation, but about love for my son and hope for his happiness, even when that happiness seemed to require my invisibility. The words settled between us like a contract, and I could see Rachel processing them, trying to understand what I was asking of her and whether she was capable of providing it. And for the first time since this conversation began, I felt genuinely uncertain about the outcome, because transformation of this magnitude required more than good intentions. It required a fundamental shift in perspective that not everyone was capable of making. I can try, she said finally, and there was something fragile in her voice, something that suggested she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what I was asking. I can try to see you differently, to treat you the way you deserve to be treated. But Angela, you have to understand that this is going to take time, that I can't just flip a switch and undo years of thinking about you in a certain way. The honesty was refreshing, even if the content wasn't entirely satisfying, because at least she was acknowledging the scope of the problem rather than minimizing it. I'm not asking you to change overnight. I said I'm asking you to commit to the process of change, to recognize that our relationship needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, and to understand that if you can't or won't make that effort, then we'll need to find a different way to coexist in David's life that protects both of us from further damage. The ultimatum was implicit but clear, and I could see in her eyes that she understood exactly what I was offering and what I was threatening to withdraw if she couldn't meet me halfway. We sat in silence for several minutes, and I found myself studying her face, trying to determine whether what I saw there was genuine remorse and commitment to change, or simply the calculation of someone trying to determine the minimum effort required to restore the status quo. And when she finally spoke, her words carried a weight that suggested she understood exactly how much was at stake in this moment. I want to try, she said. I want to learn how to see you the way you deserve to be seen, and I want to understand how to be grateful for everything you've done for us instead of resentful about things I didn't even understand. But I need you to be patient with me while I figure out how to do that, because this is all new territory for me. The request was reasonable, and yet I found myself wondering whether patience was something I still had to give after 6 years of providing it without receiving any in return. We'll see, I said, standing up from the table and gathering my purse, because this conversation had gone as far as it could go for now. We'll see what kind of effort you're willing to make, and whether it's enough to rebuild what's been broken between us. But Rachel, this is your chance to show me that you're capable of growth, and if you can't take it, then we'll both know where we stand. And as I walked away from the coffee shop, I felt something settling in my chest, something that felt like the beginning of resolution, even if the final outcome remained uncertain. The walk from the coffee shop back to my car felt different than the nervous tension I'd carried on the way there, and I realized that something fundamental had shifted in the way I moved through the world, as if claiming my right to be heard and respected had somehow given me back physical space I didn't even know I'd been surrendering. And when David called me an hour later, I could hear in his voice that Rachel had already told him about our conversation, though probably not in the same terms I would have used to describe it. Mom, he said, and there was something new in his tone, something that sounded almost like respect mixed with the familiar worry. Rachel told me about your talk today, and I think I'm finally beginning to understand what you've been trying to tell us about how we've been treating you, and how long you've been carrying burdens that should have been ours to carry. The acknowledgement felt significant because it suggested he was moving beyond simple guilt about not knowing toward genuine comprehension of the family dynamics we'd all been trapped in. I hope you are understanding, David, I said, settling into my favorite chair, the one that no longer felt like a symbol of my supposed limited circumstances, but simply like a comfortable place from which to have difficult conversations. Because this isn't just about money or even about recognition. It's about the basic respect that family members should show each other regardless of their financial situations or contributions. I wanted to make sure he grasped that the problem went deeper than mere oversight, that it touched on fundamental questions of how they valued me as a person. There was a long pause, and I could hear voices in the background. Rachel's voice, though I couldn't make out the words, and I found myself wondering what kind of conversation they'd been having about my ultimatum, about the changes I demanded, and how our family functioned. Rachel wants to apologize to you properly, David said finally. Not just for last night, but for years of treating you like you were somehow less important than the rest of us. And I want to apologize to Mom, not just for not seeing what you were doing, but for not protecting you from treatment you never should have had to endure. The offer of apologies felt both necessary and insufficient, because words alone couldn't undo years of accumulated small cruelties, of casual dismissals of assumptions that had shaped every interaction we'd had, but they were also a starting point, a foundation from which we might build something more honest and sustainable. Apologies are a beginning, I said carefully, but David, I need you to understand that protecting me going forward means more than just feeling sorry about the past. It means actively ensuring that I'm treated with respect and included in family decisions and acknowledged for my contributions, both past and present. I know, he said, and his voice carried a weight that suggested he was finally grasping the magnitude of what I was asking. And Mom, I need you to know that I've been thinking about everything you revealed, and I'm ashamed of how blind I've been, not just to your financial support, but to how Rachel and her parents have been talking about you treating you like you were some kind of charity case, when really you were the one keeping us afloat." The admission was painful to hear because it confirmed that he'd been aware on some level of the disrespect but had chosen not to address it. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked because this was the question that had been eating at me since Saturday night. "Why didn't you stand up for me when you heard them making assumptions about my circumstances, when you saw them treating me like I was somehow less capable or less valuable than everyone else at that table?" The hurt in my voice was unmistakable because his silence had felt like consent to their treatment of me, like agreement with their assessment of my worth. David was quiet for so long that I began to wonder if he'd hung up, but finally, he spoke. And his voice was thick with what sounded like genuine shame because it was easier. He said, "Because confronting Rachel about how she talked about you would have meant admitting that I didn't know where our financial stability was coming from. And I was afraid that asking too many questions might make the help stop, and I told myself that as long as you seemed okay with it, as long as you didn't complain, then maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked." The honesty was brutal and exactly what I needed to hear because it explains so much about how we'd all ended up in this situation, how my desire to help invisibly had intersected with his willingness to accept help without examination, and Rachel's tendency to diminish anyone she perceived as having less than her. "So you sacrificed my dignity to preserve your comfort," I said, and the words came out harder than I'd intended, but I needed him to understand the cost of his silence. "Yes," he said simply, "and I can't undo that, Mom, but I can promise you that it won't happen again, that from now on when I see you being treated with anything less than respect, I'll speak up immediately, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes anyone else, including me." The promise felt significant because it suggested he was finally ready to prioritize my well-being over social harmony, but I found myself wondering whether he'd have the courage to follow through when tested. "I want to believe that, David," I said, "but promises are easy when you're feeling guilty and much harder to keep when the moment comes, and speaking up might cost you something you're not sure you want to pay." The skepticism in my voice was earned through years of watching him choose the path of least resistance even when that path led over my feelings and needs. "Then let me prove it to you," he said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. "Now come to dinner next Sunday, all of us together, and let me show you that I'm ready to be the son you deserve rather than the one who's been hiding behind your generosity while pretending not to see how much it was costing you." The invitation felt like a test, and I realized that in some ways it was a chance for all of us to practice new ways of being together now that the truth was finally out in the open. Before I could respond, I heard the sound of the phone being transferred, and suddenly Rachel's voice was coming through the receiver, tentative and careful in a way I'd never heard before. "Angela," she said, "I know you probably don't want to talk to me right now, but I need you to hear this from me directly, not filtered through David's guilt or his desire to fix things between us." The directness was unexpected and suggested that our coffee shop conversation had affected her more deeply than I dared hope. "I'm listening," I said, because despite everything, despite years of accumulated hurt and Saturday night's humiliation, I still wanted to believe that people could change, that relationships could be rebuilt on better foundations if both parties were willing to do the work. "I've been thinking about what you said today about seeing you and respecting you, and I realize that I've spent 6 years seeing only what I expected to see, only what fit with my assumptions about who you were and what you could contribute to our family," Rachel said, and her voice was steady now as if she'd rehearsed these words carefully. "And I want you to know that I understand now how cruel that was, how unfair, and how much damage it must have done to you to be dismissed and diminished by someone who was benefiting from your generosity without even knowing it." The acknowledgement was more complete than anything I'd expected from her, and I found myself cautiously hopeful that perhaps our coffee shop conversation had cracked something open in her understanding, something that might actually lead to meaningful change rather than just temporary remorse. "Go on," I said, because I wanted to hear everything she had to say before I decided how to respond. "I can't undo the things I said or the way I treated you," Rachel continued, "but I can commit to doing better, to seeing you clearly, to appreciating what you've done for us, and to making sure that David and I both acknowledge your contributions, not just financially but in every way that matters." She paused, and when she spoke again her voice was smaller, more vulnerable. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I know that trust has to be earned back slowly, but I'm asking for the chance to try to show you that I can learn to be the daughter-in-law you deserve." The words daughter-in-law hit me unexpectedly hard because it had been so long since she'd referred to our relationship in terms that suggested kinship rather than obligation. And I felt something loosening in my chest, something that had been held tight for years beginning to unfurl just slightly. Rachel, I said, and my voice was gentler than it had been in any of our recent conversations. I appreciate what you're saying and I want to belie that you mean it, but I need you to understand that this isn't just about apologies or promises, it's about sustained change in how you see me and treat me, and that kind of change takes time and consistent effort. I know, she said, and I'm prepared to put in that effort, not because I feel guilty, though I do, but because I'm finally starting to understand what our family has lost by not recognizing your value. Why not appreciating everything you've quietly done to hold us together? The explanation felt genuine in a way that her earlier defensiveness hadn't, and I found myself thinking that perhaps the shock of revelation had created an opening for growth that hadn't existed before. David came back on the line then, and I could hear both hope and anxiety in his voice as he asked, "So will you come to dinner next Sunday? Will you give us a chance to show you that we can do better, that we can be the family you deserve instead of the one that's been taking you for granted for years?" The question carried so much weight because it was really asking whether I believed they were capable of change, whether I was willing to risk further disappointment in hopes of genuine healing. I thought about Mary's words about boundaries and dignity, and the importance of demanding respect rather than simply hoping for it, and I realized that accepting their invitation would be its own kind of test, not just of their commitment to change, but of my own ability to maintain the standards I'd finally found the courage to set. "Yes," I said finally, "I'll come to dinner, but I need you both to understand that this is a new beginning, not a return to the way things were, and if I see signs that we're sliding back into old patterns, then I'll leave and we'll need to find other ways to maintain our relationship." The agreement felt both hopeful and precarious, like the first steps across a bridge that might hold our weight or might collapse under the pressure of years of accumulated damage. But I knew that without taking the risk of trying, we'd never know whether healing was possible, whether the love that had motivated my years of secret sacrifice might finally be met with the recognition and respect it had always deserved. "Thank you," David said, and there was relief in his voice so profound that I could hear tears behind it. "Thank you for giving us another chance and for finally telling us the truth about everything, Eve. And when it was painful, even when it made us confront things about ourselves that we didn't want to see." And as I hung up the phone, I found myself cautiously optimistic for the first time in years that perhaps the foundation I'd built beneath their lives might finally be acknowledged and appreciated rather than simply taken for granted by people who'd never bothered to wonder where their stability came from. Sunday came with the kind of nervous anticipation I hadn't felt in years, the way you feel before important job interviews or first dates, when the outcome could fundamentally change the trajectory of your life. And as I chose my clothes that morning, I found myself thinking about armor, about the difference between dressing to disappear and dressing to be seen, and I selected the burgundy silk blouse Harold had bought me for our last anniversary before he died, the one that made me feel elegant and valuable rather than modest and apologetic. The drive to David and Rachel's apartment felt different this time, like traveling toward possibility rather than obligation, and when I knocked on their door I noticed that my hands weren't shaking the way they had the previous Sunday when I'd been carrying the weight of secrets I didn't know how to bear much longer. And Rachel answered with a smile that looked genuine rather than performative, her eyes meeting mine directly instead of sliding away with the uncomfortable avoidance that had characterized our interactions for years. "Angela," she said, and there was warmth in her voice that I hadn't heard since the early days of her relationship with David, before she decided I wasn't worth the effort of real politeness. "Thank you for coming. I know this week has been difficult for all of us, but I'm so glad you're here." The greeting felt like an acknowledgement of everything that had passed between us and a tentative offer of something better going forward. David appeared behind her, and when he hugged me there was something different in the way he held me. Something that felt like genuine affection rather than dutiful obligation, and when he pulled back I could see in his eyes that he was really looking at me, perhaps for the first time in years. Seeing not just his aging mother who needed management, but the woman who had quietly shaped his adult life in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Mom," he said, and his voice carried a weight of meaning that made the simple word feel like a complete sentence. "I'm sorry it took so long for us to see you properly, but I promise that's changing. Ting today." The apology was brief, but it felt solid, grounded in understanding rather than just guilt, and I found myself believing that he meant it, that the shock of revelation had created space for genuine growth in our relationship. The apartment looked exactly the same as it had the week before but somehow felt entirely different, as if the truth I'd finally spoken had changed the very air inside these rooms. And when Rachel gestured toward the dining room, I could see that. She'd set the table with the same expensive china, but this time, there was something in her manner that suggested she understood exactly how that china had been paid for and by whom. "I wanted to talk before we eat," Rachel said as we settled around the table, and there was a formality in her posture that suggested she'd prepared for this moment, had thought carefully about what she wanted to say. "Because I need you to know that I've spent this entire week thinking about our conversation and about the 6 years that led up to it, and I finally understand not just what I did wrong but why it was so wrong." The words came out carefully as if she'd rehearsed them, but there was genuine feeling behind them that made me pay attention in a way I hadn't been able to during our coffee shop confrontation. David reached over and took my hand, a gesture that felt both protective and supportive, and I could see that he was ready to intervene if this conversation went badly, but also that he was prepared to let Rachel speak for herself, to take responsibility for her own transformation rather than having him mediate every difficult moment between us. "I treated you like you were somehow less than us," Rachel continued, and her voice was steady but I could see tears gathering in her eyes. "I made assumptions about your circumstances and your capabilities, and I used those assumptions to justify treating you with disrespect that no one deserves, especially not someone who was quietly making our entire life possible." The acknowledgement was more complete than anything I'd expected, and I felt something shifting inside me, something that had been hard and defensive beginning to soften just slightly. "But more than that," she said, and now the tears were falling freely though her voice remained strong. "I robbed David of the chance to properly appreciate his mother, and I robbed myself of the chance to have a real relationship with someone who clearly loved us enough to sacrifice her own recognition for our happiness, and I can't undo that, but I can commit to doing better going forward." The words hit me with unexpected force because they showed an understanding not just of the financial dynamics but of the emotional costs that my secrecy had imposed on all of us. David squeezed my hand, and when he spoke his voice was thick with emotion. "Mom, what Rachel is trying to say, and what I need to say too, is that we're sorry not just for not knowing about the money but for creating an environment where you felt like you had to hide your generosity where being acknowledged for your sacrifices felt impossible because of our pride and our blindness and our willingness to let you carry burdens that should have been shared." His apology felt comprehensive, addressing not just the immediate crisis but the underlying family dynamics that had made the crisis inevitable. "I appreciate what you're both saying," I said, and my voice was careful because I wanted to acknowledge their efforts without minimizing the depth of the changes that would be required. "But I need you to understand that this isn't just about apologies or even about recognition. It's about fundamentally changing how our family functions, how we communicate about important things, how we acknowledge each other's contributions, and how we ensure that everyone feels valued for who they are rather than judged for what others assume about their circumstances." Rachel nodded eagerly as if she'd been hoping I would lay out exactly what was required. "Tell us what that looks like," she said. "Tell us how to do better, because I know I have years of wrong assumptions to unlearn, and I want to make sure I'm not just apologizing but actually changing in ways that matter." The request felt genuine, and I found myself thinking that perhaps the shock of discovering how wrong she'd been had created an opening for growth that wouldn't have existed under less dramatic circumstances. "It means seeing me as someone whose opinions matter," I said, and as I spoke I could feel myself claiming space I'd given up years ago. "It means including me in family decisions and conversations, rather than talking around me or about me. It means recognizing that my choice to live simply doesn't reflect inability but preference, and it means understanding that my contributions to this family extend far beyond money, to include emotional support and practical help and the kind of quiet love that doesn't demand credit but deserves acknowledgement when it's finally recognized." David was nodding with the kind of intensity that suggested he was memorizing every word. "And it means that when someone disrespects you or makes assumptions about you, I speak up immediately," he said. "Not later when it's convenient or when I feel guilty, but in the moment when it matters, when my voice can actually protect you from treatment you shouldn't have to endure." The commitment felt significant because it addressed what had been perhaps the most painful aspect of the previous Sunday, the way he'd allowed Rachel's cruelties to go unchallenged. "Yes," I said, "and it means that we're honest with each other about important things like finances and family decisions, and emotional needs, instead of making assumptions or keeping secrets that end up hurting everyone involved. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was advocating for honesty after 6 years of secrecy, but I'd learned that some secrets protect people while others trap them. And the secret of my financial support had become a trap for all of us. Rachel leaned forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability I'd never heard before. Angela, I want you to know that I'm not just sorry about how I treated you, I'm actually grateful for everything you've done for us. And I want to find ways to show that gratitude not just in words but in actions, and how I treat you and talk about you and include you in our lives. The offer felt like the beginning of something new, something that might actually resemble the family relationship I'd hoped for when David first brought her home. I like that, I said, and for the first time in this conversation, I felt genuinely hopeful rather than just cautiously optimistic. But Rachel, I need you to understand that gratitude can't just be about the money. It has to be about recognizing me as a complete person with my own needs and feelings and opinions that matter regardless of what I've contributed financially. The distinction was important because I didn't want to trade one form of invisibility for another, didn't want to be seen only as a benefactor rather than as a whole human being. I understand, she said, and I want to get to know you properly, not just as David's mother, or as someone who helped us financially, but as Angela, the person with her own life and interests and perspectives that I never bothered to ask about because I was too busy making assumptions about what you could or couldn't offer. The acknowledgement of her lack of curiosity about me as an individual felt like another step toward genuine understanding. David cleared his throat, and when he spoke, there was something almost ceremonial in his tone. Mom, I want to make sure you know that going forward, any financial arrangement we have will be completely transparent and entirely your choice. No more secret payments, no more anonymous support. If you want to help us with anything, we'll discuss it openly, and if you decide you want to stop or change how you contribute, that's entirely up to you, without guilt or pressure from either of us. The offer felt like a restoration of my agency in a situation where I'd somehow surrendered control without meaning to. And Rachel added quickly, if you ever want to change how you live, if you want to move somewhere bigger or buy things you've been denying yourself or travel or anything else that would make you happy, please don't let concern for our finances stop you. We'll figure out how to manage our own expenses like adults should have been doing all along. The statement felt like recognition that my modest lifestyle had been at least partially motivated by their needs rather than purely by my preferences. The conversation continued through dinner, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was participating in a family gathering rather than simply attending one. Felt like my presence was valued rather than tolerated. And when Rachel asked about my garden and my book club and my volunteer work at the library, I realized that these were the first questions she'd ever asked about my life outside of my relationship to David and their needs. By the time I left that evening, something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic, and while I knew that real change would require sustained effort over time, rather than just good intentions expressed during one difficult conversation, I felt for the first time that such change was actually possible, that the foundation I'd built beneath their lives might finally be acknowledged and appreciated rather than simply taken for granted. David walked me to my car, and as I prepared to leave, he said quietly, Mom, I know we have a lot of work to do to repair the damage that's been done, but I want you to know that I finally see you clearly, and I'm proud to be your son, not because of what you've given us, but because of who you are as a person. The words felt like a gift I'd been waiting years to receive, and as I drove home, I found myself thinking that perhaps the truth had been worth the pain of speaking it after all. That perhaps some secrets are meant to be broken so that better relationships can be built from the pieces. 3 months later, I stood in the community center that David and Rachel had rented for their first annual neighborhood potluck, a gathering they'd organized to celebrate David's promotion properly this time, but also to introduce themselves more fully to the community they'd been living in for 6 years without really connecting with the people around them. And as I watched Rachel greet our neighbors with genuine warmth, rather than the calculating social assessment I'd grown accustomed to, I realized that the changes in our family had rippled outward in ways none of us had expected. The invitation to speak had come from Rachel herself 2 weeks earlier, when she'd called to ask if I would be willing to share some thoughts about family communication and the importance of seeing beyond assumptions. And when I'd expressed surprise that she wanted me to address the gathering publicly, she'd said simply, Angela, you have wisdom that people need to hear, and it's time everyone knew how valuable your voice is. which was perhaps the most profound acknowledgement of my worth I'd received from her in all the years I'd known her. I wore the burgundy silk blouse again, but this time paired with the pearl necklace Harold had given me for our wedding, the one I'd kept in my jewelry box for special occasions. That never seemed quite special enough, and as I looked at myself in the mirror that morning, I saw not a woman trying to make herself invisible, but someone who had earned the right to take up space, to be seen and heard and valued for exactly who she was. David found me in the crowd an hour into the event, and, when he approached, his face was lit with the kind of pride I'd dreamed of seeing there for years. "Mom," he said, pulling me into a hug that felt natural and unguarded, "thank you for agreeing to speak tonight, and thank you for everything else, for being patient with us while we learned how to see you properly, for never giving up on our family, even when we gave you plenty of reasons to." The gratitude in his voice was genuine and complete, free from the guilt that had colored our interactions for months after my revelation. "I want you to know," he continued, "that Rachel and I have been talking about this event for weeks, and we both agreed that nothing we've accomplished would have been possible without your support. And we wanted everyone to know that, not just about the financial help, but about the emotional strength you've shown in holding our family together even when we made it difficult for you." The public acknowledgement felt revolutionary, coming from a son who had spent years minimizing my contributions to preserve his own sense of independence. Rachel joined us then, carrying a glass of wine and wearing an expression of what looked like genuine excitement rather than the social performance anxiety that had characterized her hosting efforts in the past. "Angela," she said, "I've been telling everyone about your speech tonight, and people are really looking forward to hearing from you. Mrs. Peterson from next door said she's been wondering about you for years and wishes she'd made more effort to get to know you properly." The information surprised me because I'd assumed my neighbors saw me the same way my family had, as someone whose life was too small and circumstances too limited to warrant much curiosity. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversations with people I'd been living near for years, without really knowing. Discovered that Mrs. Peterson was a retired teacher who shared my love of historical fiction, that the young couple from the third floor were struggling with financial stress in ways that reminded me of David and Rachel's early years, that the elderly man from the ground floor was a widower like me, who'd been managing his grief in much the same quiet way I'd been managing mine. And I realized that my own assumptions about my neighbors had been almost as limiting as their assumptions about me. When the time came for me to speak, David introduced me with words that would have been unimaginable just 3 months earlier. "I want you all to meet someone who's been the foundation of our family in ways we were too blind to see for far too long," he said. "My mother, Angela Kent, who has taught us that real strength often works quietly, and that the most important contributions to family life are sometimes the ones that go unacknowledged until someone has the courage to demand the recognition they've always deserved." The introduction made me feel seen in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I stood before the gathered neighbors, feeling nervous but also certain that I had something worth saying, something that had emerged from years of invisible sacrifice and recent months of visible transformation. "I want to talk tonight about the difference between helping and hiding." I began, "about the way we sometimes love people by making ourselves smaller rather than by teaching them to make space for us as we actually are." The words came more easily than I'd expected, as if speaking my truth to my family had unlocked a voice I'd been suppressing for years. "For 6 years," I continued, "I supported my son and daughter-in-law financially while allowing them to believe I was the one who needed support, and I told myself I was protecting their pride. But what I was really doing was protecting myself from the risk of rejection, from the possibility that they might not want my help if they knew where it was coming from." The admission felt liberating rather than shameful, because I'd finally learned to distinguish between secrecy born of love and secrecy born of fear. "The cost of that choice," I said, looking directly at Rachel and David, who were listening with the kind of attention that suggested they were still learning things about our situation, "wasn't just to me, though. It was painful to be seen as a burden while I was actually providing foundation. It was to all of us, because secrets create distance, even when they're meant to create closeness, and assumptions fill the spaces where honest conversation should be." The observation seemed to resonate with several people in the audience, who nodded as if recognizing their own family dynamics in what I was describing. "But I want you to know," I continued, and my voice grew stronger as I reached the heart of what I wanted to share, "that it's never too late to change these patterns, never too late to speak truth that's been hidden, never too late to ask for the recognition and respect you deserve. As long as you're willing to risk the discomfort that comes with being fully seen. The words felt like a promise I was making not just to the audience, but to myself, a commitment to continue living visibly, even when visibility felt dangerous. Rachel stood up then, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the room with surprising strength. I want everyone here to know. She said that Angela has been the most generous person I've ever known, and I spent years being too arrogant and too blind to see it, but she never gave up on you. Our family never stopped believing we could do better, and I'm grateful every day that she finally found the courage to show us who she really was instead of who we expected her to be. The public acknowledgement felt like a gift I'd never thought to ask for. When the formal speaking portion of the evening ended, I found myself surrounded by neighbors who wanted to continue the conversation, to share their own stories of family, misunderstandings, and hidden sacrifices and gradual healing, and I realized that the experience I'd thought was uniquely mine was actually part of a much larger human pattern of people learning to see each other clearly, often only after years of looking through filters of assumption and expectation. Mrs. Peterson approached me as the evening was winding down and took my hand with the kind of warmth that suggested she'd been waiting for this opportunity for years. Angela, she said, I hope you'll consider joining my book club. We meet every other Thursday, and I think you'd have wonderful insights to contribute to our discussions, and I'm sorry it took a community event for us to finally have a real conversation. The invitation felt like evidence that my newfound visibility was creating opportunities for connection I'd never allowed myself to imagine. As David and Rachel walked me to my car at the end of the evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of completion, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was finally honest. Mom, David said as we reached my car, I want you to know that tonight was exactly what our family needed, a chance to celebrate you publicly, the way we should have been doing privately for years. His words felt like confirmation that the painful process of revelation and reconciliation had led somewhere worth going. Angela, Rachel added, I've been thinking about what you said about making space for people as they actually are, and I want you to know that I'm committed to continuing to learn who you really are beyond all the assumptions I made for so long, and I hope you'll be patient with me while I figure out how to be the daughter-in-law you deserve. The request for patience felt different from her earlier pleas because it was grounded in understanding rather than desperation. Standing there in the parking lot with my son and daughter-in-law, I realized that the woman who had driven to their apartment 3 months ago carrying secrets that were slowly poisoning her relationships had been replaced by someone who could speak her truth, claim her worth, and demand the respect she'd always deserved. And while I knew that maintaining these changes would require ongoing effort from all of us, I also knew that we'd crossed a threshold we could never uncross. As I drove home that night, I found myself thinking not about the years I'd spent in shadows, but about the years ahead, the possibilities that opened up when you stopped hiding who you were and started insisting that others see you clearly. And when I pulled into my apartment complex, I realized that it no longer felt like a place I'd retreated to out of necessity, but like a home I'd chosen because it suited the life I wanted to live. Simply and deliberately, and with the confidence that came from knowing my worth was no longer hidden or denied. The message light on my answering machine was blinking when I walked through my door, and when I played it back, I heard Mary's voice, warm with the satisfaction of someone whose advice had proved sound. Angela, she said, I heard about your speech tonight from Mrs. Peterson, and I just wanted you to know how proud I am of you for finding your voice and using it, and for showing the rest of us what it looks like to stop making yourself small so other people can feel bigger. The message felt like a benediction, a confirmation that the journey from invisible sacrifice to visible dignity had been worth every difficult step. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my favorite chair, the one that had witnessed my transformation from someone who carried other people's lives to someone who lived fully in her own. And as I sat there, I thought about Harold and how proud he would be of the woman I'd become, not just the generous benefactor I'd always been, but the self-advocating, dignified person who had finally learned to value herself as much as she valued the people she loved. And I knew with certainty that this was just the beginning of a life lived without apology, without hiding, without the exhausting effort of being less than I was so others could be comfortable with who they assumed me to be. The future stretched ahead, full of possibilities I'd never allowed myself to imagine. Family relationships built on honesty rather than assumption, friendships with neighbors who knew me as I actually was, volunteer work and travel, and all the dreams I deferred while I was busy making other people's dreams possible. And for the first time in years, I felt excited about tomorrow not because of what I could give others, but because of what I could finally claim for myself.